Hey guys, tonight we slip into something a little less comfortable, like a linen nightshirt in a freezing cold English manor. You've just stepped into the Elizabethan age, in your luxurious chamber. It's mostly stone. Cold stone. Drafty, echoey, slightly damp stone. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones and makes your teeth feel like glass. Your bed looks inviting, four-poster, carved oak, velvet canopy, but the mattress feels like it's been stored in a cellar since the last plague. And surprise, it's practically frozen. No insulation. No central heating. Just the hollow groan of winter wind threading through the cracks. Welcome to the good life of a noble in the late 1500s. You're expected to fall asleep here. Maybe even enjoy it. You're wearing several layers of embroidered nightclothes, you've just downed a thick posset, hot milk, ale, maybe an egg, and your only hope for survival tonight? A dedicated bed-warming servant. Yes, someone hired specifically to make sure your backside doesn't turn into an icicle when you roll into bed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it over there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the bed like a knight toward battle, the chill licking at your ankles. The servant has already passed through, probably an hour ago, toting a long-handled brass pan filled with glowing embers. He ran it methodically between the sheets, careful not to scorch the linen or accidentally light the bed curtains on fire. Both of which, by the way, happen more often than anyone would like to admit. And yes, this is considered luxury. The middle and lower classes? They have their own tricks, like sleeping together in bundles for warmth, or laying flat on straw mattresses beside the hearth like cats. But for the Elizabethan elite, warm beds weren't just about comfort, they were a symbol. A sign that you had made it. That your toes would not freeze and snap off like overcooked parsnips. It wasn't all fun in feather beds, though. These homes weren't built with heating in mind. Chimneys were relatively new and mostly confined to wealthier homes. Before that, central hearths just spilled smoke into the house, escaping through high vents or louver boards in the roof. It helped, kind of. But it also meant you smelled like bacon and soot most of the time. Still, these were grand homes, and appearance mattered. So, rather than install something practical like wall insulation, they'd hang elaborate tapestries over the stone to try and trap heat. The result? Cold, damp air with just a whisper of warmed-up wool and mildew. Add a few wood smoke wisps and the perfume of dried lavender, and congratulations, your room smells like a medieval tea shop having an identity crisis. By the time you're ready for sleep, you're already exhausted from existing in layers. The wool. The starch. The velvet. Everything itches or clings in weird places. But you don't have the energy to complain, especially not to your staff, who've spent the entire evening preparing your bedchamber like a royal stage. And beds weren't just cold, they were enormous. Sometimes elevated so high you'd need a stool or a servant's shoulder to climb into them. Mattress technology was, well, let's say experimental. Some were stuffed with straw, others with feathers. Some even layered wool with horsehair, giving the comforting feeling of sleeping on a hay bale wrapped in a disappointed sheep. The bed had to be large enough for more than one person. Not because couples were cuddly, but because nobles often shared their beds, sometimes with children, companions, or guests. In fact, the idea of the private bedroom didn't really exist yet. Your sleeping space was just another room where things happened, conversations, politics, even small meetings. And through all of this, the cold remained. Persistent. Familiar. A nightly nuisance. And thus, the need for professional help. Bed warming servants were a solution born of necessity and luxury. Their tools were varied, their techniques delicate. They would arrive before bedtime, sometimes even multiple times per night if the air turned especially bitter, and begin their slow ritual of coaxing heat into your sheets. A common method involved a warming pan, basically a shallow metal container with a lid, attached to a long wooden handle. Inside? Glowing embers or heated stones, sometimes infused with herbs for scent. The servant would pass it between the sheets slowly, letting the heat spread without scorching anything. It required focus, care, and ideally, no sparks. Unless you wanted the smell of smoldering linen to keep you company all night. But there were variations. Some used earthenware pots filled with hot coals and wrapped in cloth. Others employed heated bricks nestled in furs. The poor man's solution? A warm dog. Which, honestly, was more efficient than half the tech of the time. Now, historians still argue whether warming pans were more of a theatrical display of wealth or a practical necessity. Some say the elite could have afforded better insulation if they'd prioritized it. Others point out that, in a time when illness was believed to lurk in cold air, warmth itself became a form of medicine. And so, each night, as you prepare to sleep in your towering wooden bed beneath a ceiling heavy with carved beams and shadows, you know someone has come before you. Not to pray. Not to tuck you in. But to fight off the frost like a footman battling winter with a brass frying pan. You're rich. You're cold. And frankly, you're not about to lift a finger about it. That's the beauty of being an Elizabethan noble, isn't it? You don't need to concern yourself with the mechanics of warmth, just the expectation of it. If the bed isn't properly toasted by the time you step inside, someone will be sacked. Or at the very least, very apologetic while fanning your feet with a goosefeather pillow. Being noble in this era wasn't just about wealth, it was about performance. Every aspect of your daily life, from the lace at your collar to the way you pointed your shoes, was meticulously crafted to project status. And warmth? Oh, warmth was status. No chill toes here, thank you. That's why the role of the bed warming servant became so crucial. These weren't just nameless peasants shuffled into the shadows of your life. No, these were trained individuals who understood the delicate balance between heat and linen, between readiness and restraint. They were like human thermostats, with slightly better manners. And of course, having one wasn't just about the practical perk. It sent a message: I am important enough to delegate thermal regulation. Queen Elizabeth herself had entire teams managing her sleeping arrangements, velvet mattresses, fur-lined blankets, and yes, attendants responsible for ensuring her bedchambers stayed at an agreeable temperature, especially during those long, frost-bitten London nights. You may wonder, how did these positions come about? Well, long before central heating and electric blankets, nobles relied on a hierarchy of servants to create a livable interior ecosystem. And bed warming was a specialty, one that often required trust, discretion, and more than a little patience. Some households even had custom job titles for these attendants. While we don't always know the precise name, there's no official warder of the bedpan recorded. What we do find in household inventories are yeomen of the chamber, grooms of the bedchamber, and even night servants. These individuals were responsible for the entire bedtime ritual, which included heating the bed, laying out nightclothes, and ensuring that chamber pots were clean and within reach, because nothing ruins a dreamy slumber like a midnight stumble over last night's stew. It wasn't just about the bed, either. Fireplaces needed stoking, night candles had to be trimmed, and heavy curtains drawn close to keep the night air at bay. And if you were especially well off, your warming servant might also light scented herbs to cleanse the air, usually a bundle of lavender, rosemary, or dried rose petals mixed with crushed cloves. One guest at a noble's home reportedly commented that the entire bedroom smelled like a bride's hamper, which we assume was a compliment. There's something rather comical about how much effort it took just to make the bed inhabitable. Imagine trying to do all of this yourself: shovel coals, heat the pan, wait for the embers to die down enough not to torch the sheets, then swish it rhythmically between the covers like you're stirring a pot of velvet stew. No thank you. And then there's the social etiquette. You, the noble, weren't just lounging around watching all of this. You had your own tasks, sipping your posset, listening to your fool, maybe discussing tomorrow's hawking expedition. But it was still important that things looked seamless. The transition from cold chamber to cozy bed had to be invisible. The warming was done ahead of time, ideally when you were still at supper or in the solar entertaining guests. That way, when you finally yawned and declared it was time to retire, the bed was magically prepared. No effort, no drafts, just layers of inviting warmth. Of course, there were pitfalls. Occasionally, the warming pans left behind little scorch marks, known as blisters in period accounts, or worse, set the bedding alight. Fire was an ever-present threat, and many castles kept watchmen posted through the night just to listen for the telltale crackle of an accidental blaze. As a result, some nobles began experimenting with non-flame-based warming techniques, like using heated tiles or metal canisters. Still risky, but slightly less explosive. And let's not forget that being in charge of warming someone's bed, especially someone important, was a position that required absolute discretion. These servants were among the last people the nobles saw before falling asleep. If you were part of the inner household, you might have overheard private conversations, witnessed midnight visitors, or discovered personal habits no one else was meant to see. Historians still argue whether these servants were merely overlooked tools of comfort or silent observers of courtly intrigue. Some suggest that warming maids and chamber grooms may have been sources for gossip and even minor political influence, simply by virtue of what they saw and heard behind those heavy bed curtains. So here you are, lying under multiple layers of embroidered linen and stuffed wool, knowing your sleep has been curated like a royal garden. The warmth creeping through your sheets is not accidental, it's the product of someone's labor, timed perfectly to coincide with your nightly descent into dreams. And really, what more could a noble want? You have furs. You have finery. You have 15 goose feathers poking into your back, but that's beside the point. Your comfort has been ensured by a network of human warmth bringers. And if your feet are still cold? Well, there's always next year's fashion, gold-threaded heated slippers. surely someone will invent those soon. Tonight, you're in for a treat. Your bed has been warmed with exquisite care, and now you're finally curious, what exactly did that servant use? The Elizabethan bed warmers toolkit was an eclectic mix of medieval pragmatism and upper-class flair. These weren't just household items, they were hand-picked instruments in the silent nightly battle against the chill. You'll find no electric blankets here, of course, but what you will find are some surprisingly creative, and occasionally questionable, methods of generating warmth. Let's start with the most iconic, the brass warming pan. Picture this, a shallow, circular pan, often beautifully decorated with floral motifs or even family crests, attached to a long wooden handle. Inside, it held a layer of smoldering embers or hot coals, sometimes nestled in ash to extend their heat without bursting into open flame. The servant would insert the pan between the bed sheets and move it gently from one end of the mattress to the other in wide, sweeping motions. The goal was to chase away the cold, not invite disaster. If they moved too fast, the sheets wouldn't heat evenly. Too slow? You risked scorch marks or the distinct aroma of gently roasted linen. The trick was in the timing, something that took practice and the occasional oops to master. Which explains why experienced warming servants were surprisingly valuable in wealthier households. But the warming pan wasn't the only tool at their disposal. Sometimes servants would prepare what were known as bedstones or bed bottles. These were essentially slabs of stone or thick ceramic jugs, heated by the hearth and then wrapped in cloth or fur. Once safely insulated, they'd be tucked into the foot of the bed to radiate heat throughout the night. And yes, someone had to carry those things across cold stone floors, carefully wrapped in position so you didn't accidentally toast your shins or get a second-degree burn on your delicate noble calves. One lesser-known method? Charcoal pillows. These were small cloth bags filled with ash or embers that had been filtered through layers of linen. They were warm, fragrant with lavender or cloves, and delightfully cozy, until they weren't. If handled incorrectly, they could release ash or, worse, sparks. Several journals from the period recount tales of these sleeping grenades going off midnight, causing enough excitement to ruin anyone's beauty rest. And here's a little oddity, in some households, they'd boil stones, yes, boil them, then wrap them in fabric and place them beneath the covers. The theory was that hot water clung better to heat than dry stone. Was it effective? Historians still argue whether boiled rocks were worth the hassle or just another example of Tudor over-engineering. And then there were the organic solutions. We've touched on this briefly, but some nobles skipped the tools entirely and went straight for the fur-wrapped live solution, a small dog. Not just for cuddles, mind you. Lapdogs like King Charles Spaniels or Comforter Spaniels were quite literally bred to be warm, compact, and portable. These little heat blobs were placed in the bed long before their noble owners arrived, positioned like a little living bedstone with a wagging tail. Some even argued these dogs were preferable to warming pans because they came with less risk of spontaneous combustion and more chance of companionship. After all, who wouldn't want to fall asleep with a living, breathing, self-heating foot warmer? There's also evidence that certain beds were double-decked. A warming apparatus would be slid underneath a thin lower mattress, so the rising heat would gently filter up into the sleeper's domain without direct contact. Of course, this only worked in large enough beds with clever design. And considering some of these frames creaked like haunted ships, let's just say it was an ambitious workaround. By now, you're probably wondering, did any of this really work? The answer is, sort of. These methods all helped mitigate the worst of the cold, but none could completely banish the chill, especially on windy January nights when the Thames turned to slush and the air in your manor's hallway felt like a ghost's breath. Still, the Elizabethans believed in layers, and layers upon layers. You'd sleep under wool, over feathers, beside bricks, and occasionally next to a snoring pet or a poorly banked fire. The entire room was a patchwork of heat sources, some subtle, others sizzling. And don't forget the power of scent. Many warming tools were infused with herbs and flowers to mask the smell of coal or burning cloth. Clove, cinnamon, thyme, dried orange peel, each was crushed and tied into muslin sachets, then tossed into the warming pans or stuffed inside pillowcases. It created a rich, layered fragrance, a dreamy haze that lulled you towards sleep while gently masking the occasional whiff of smoldering underwear. Historians still debate how widespread these warming methods were. Some argue they were mostly found in the homes of the wealthy elite, while others suggest regional variation. Certain households in the north of England, or colder parts of the Scottish borders, may have prioritized more elaborate warming rituals simply out of survival. And yet, what's most fascinating is how personal these routines were. Some nobles insisted on rosemary under the mattress. Others wanted the warming pan passed 3 times, always clockwise. A few demanded their bedstones be warmed to a precise temperature, though how that was measured without a thermometer is anyone's guess. Likely, the poor servant just guessed and prayed the noble didn't shriek upon contact. Tonight, though, your bed is perfectly warmed. The embers are cooling safely in their pan, tucked away on a stone hearth. The sheets are soft, the air faintly sweet, and somewhere in the distance, your warming servant tiptoes quietly away, his duty done. Sleep awaits. But first, roll over carefully. Those boiled rocks stay hot longer than you think. It's one thing to warm a bed, it's another to not accidentally set it ablaze in the process. And that's where the art of not burning down your master's sleeping quarters becomes a highly specialized skill. Tonight, you shadow the bed-warming servant. Not the glamorous job, perhaps, but one that carries more risk than you'd imagine for a position that rarely makes it into the history books. There's danger in every glowing ember, and the stakes are high, because nothing ruins a noble's mood faster than scorched linens or singed toes. You enter the bedchamber carrying the warming pan, its polished brass reflecting the flicker of nearby candlelight. Inside, a carefully arranged heap of embers sits quietly, cloaked in a fine layer of ash to control the burn. You test the heat with a practiced hand, not too hot, not too cool. The embers must be glowing, but not so fiery that they risk igniting the sheets like kindling. The bed looms before you. Grand, sprawling, with a frame as thick as a fence post. The linens have been freshly laid out, bottom sheet stretched tight, top sheet delicately embroidered, and heavy woolen blankets folded just so. You lift the canopy edge and slide in the warming pan, moving it slowly, smoothly, in steady figure eights beneath the covers. A sudden creak of the floorboards makes your heart skip. Was that the master arriving early? You quicken your movements, still careful. The dance of the pan must be fluid, too fast and the bed stays cold, too slow and the heat concentrates dangerously. You learn that the hard way last winter when Lady Pembroke's chambermaid left a little sunburst in the mattress. The poor girl was reassigned to kitchen duty for 3 months. You finish your route, pull out the pan, and let it cool on the stone hearth. You give the bed a final fluff with the wooden paddle, used not just for appearance, but to evenly distribute any remaining warmth. It's here that you realize, being a bed warmer wasn't merely a task, it was a performance. An invisible act of service that, when done right, no one noticed. But get it wrong, and you became the talk of the manor for all the wrong reasons. And this wasn't a one-size-fits-all situation either. Some nobles had preferences. Lord Danbury, for example, liked the bed warmed in precise quadrants, in a clockwise pattern, beginning at the foot. Lady Beatrix insisted on a double warming, once an hour before bed, and once immediately before she entered. Her nerves, she claimed, were sensitive to temperature shock. Others preferred to warm only the foot of the bed, believing it encouraged blood flow and staved off nightmares. Yes, really. Elizabethan sleep theory was a murky mix of ancient Greek humors and creative home remedies. Warm feet meant good digestion and calm thoughts, or at least fewer dreams about devilish cats stealing your breath. Of course, there were mishaps. Entire manuals of etiquette and household management from the era include offhand warnings about bed warming hazards. A pan left in too long might burn a hole through fine linen. A spark caught in the folds of a canopy could ruin a family's legacy, and their favorite nightcap. There's even a recorded incident in 1596 where the bedding of a minor baronet allegedly caught fire, causing a flurry of panicked servants and a half-naked nobleman to rush into the courtyard midwinter. It took days for the scandal to die down. Naturally, he blamed the warming maid, who was quietly removed from the household and, rumor has it, hired elsewhere for her knowledge of fiery temperament. But even when things didn't go up in smoke, the job came with other hazards. The pans were heavy. Embers could crack and spark. Your arms ached from repetitive swishing. And then there was the smoke. Inhaling just a bit too much on a breezy night could leave you wheezing for hours. Some servants even stuffed lavender or rosemary into their sleeves, not just to smell nice, but to counteract the scent of coal dust clinging to their hands. Historians still debate whether bed warming was a formal training role or something learned on the job. There's no known guild of professional sleep warmers, but you can bet households pass down tips like family recipes: always stir the embers first, never warm wet sheets, and for heaven's sake, don't trip on the chamber pot. And here's a strange little fringe tidbit: some houses believe that improper bed warming could invite bad spirits. Yes, in certain rural areas, servants were warned not to anger the mattress ghosts by clanging the pan or rushing the ritual. One servant's journal even recounts being told to sing softly while warming the bed, though whether that was for spiritual protection or simple superstition is anyone's guess. Still, the practice endured. It became part of the rhythm of the household, a moment of quiet service in the blur of evening preparations. Just as cooks knew the kitchen's heartbeat and stable hands knew every horse's cough, the warming servant knew the texture of the linens, the creak of each bed frame, and the subtle art of delivering warmth without incident. And now, as you place the cooled pan back in its corner and brush your soot-streaked sleeves, you look back at the bed, unassuming, inviting, and ever so slightly steaming. A job well done, and another night saved from the clutches of frostbite and flammable upholstery. You slip away into the corridors, your work unnoticed by those who will soon benefit from it. And that, in the Elizabethan household, is the highest praise you can hope for. Warming the bed was just the beginning. Once the sheets were toasty, your work as a servant might have continued in ways both surprising and, at times, absurd. Because, you see, a bed warmer was rarely just a bed warmer. In Elizabethan noble households, roles were fluid. And if you were already in the room entrusted with something as intimate as preparing the master's bed, well, why not spray a little rosewater while you're at it? Maybe plump a pillow? Or perhaps listen, politely, discreetly, to a rambling half-drunken noble recount the day's hunting triumphs, in great detail, with more pride than accuracy. Tonight, you're performing the full routine. You arrive an hour before your master retires, a brass pan in one hand, a scented linen pouch in the other, and a well-rehearsed smile hovering on your lips. The room smells faintly of beeswax candles and old velvet. You start with the usual, sweep the coals through the bed, flick out any ash, then set the warm pan aside. But before you can slip away, the ritual begins. "Make sure it smells pleasant tonight," your mistress once said. "Not like firewood and regret." And so you do. From a drawer wrapped in embroidered silk, you remove a sachet of dried herbs, lavender, mint, and something vaguely citrusy, and lightly sprinkle it over the sheets. It's not exactly perfume, but it masks the lingering scent of coal and damp wool that hangs around even the best-kept rooms. Next, you fluff the pillows. Carefully. There's a specific shape your mistress prefers, the half-moon cradle. It took you 3 months to figure out what that meant and another 2 to perfect it. A crooked pillow equals a restless night, and a restless night means everyone's miserable by breakfast. But tonight, she's in a good mood. Which means, lucky you, she might engage you in conversation. You stand at attention, listening to her recount how Lord Devonshire nearly fell off his horse, or how the Queen's latest gown has far too much gold leaf, if such a thing were possible. You nod at the right moments, you chuckle softly, and you carefully say nothing that might sound like an opinion. Being neutral is a survival skill here, more so than knowing how to handle hot metal. Some nobles liked conversation before bed. Others, music. There are accounts of servants humming lullabies softly while laying out linens, or even playing gentle melodies on small instruments just outside the bedchamber door. One earl in Yorkshire reportedly had a servant whose entire job was to sit nearby and read psalms aloud until he snored. Not every noble requested this level of service, of course. But in houses with more money than sense, bedtime was as much a production as dinner. And servants like you were expected to juggle multiple roles without ever making it obvious. You're a cleaner, a comforter, a confidant, and if something goes wrong in the night, the first one to be blamed. There's a peculiar intimacy to the role. You know how your lord likes the edge of the sheet tucked. You know her left knee gets cold first, even under 3 wool blankets. You know which eiderdown is too scratchy and which one causes sneezing fits. You know what side of the bed each noble says they sleep on, and which one they actually roll toward when they think no one's looking. Historians still argue whether these roles were prestigious within the servant hierarchy or simply burdensome. On one hand, you're trusted to be near your master's most private space. On the other, if anything is even slightly out of place, like the wrong blanket being used or the warming pan being left in the fireplace instead of beside it, it's your head on the line. Or, more likely, your backside out the door. One fringe account from a lesser-known household mentions a bedservant who doubled as an astrologer's apprentice. Apparently, the lord in question wouldn't sleep without hearing a favorable reading for the night's planetary alignment. "Your dreams are blessed by Venus," the servant would say, deadpan. "You may now proceed to snore. And don't forget the dogs. Or the cats." Or, in one case, the parrot who had to be covered with a velvet cloth and cooed to sleep before the countess would close her eyes. All of this was your job. The warm bed was only the foundation. Your true role was to create the illusion of peace, of comfort, of perfectly curated rest. It's no surprise that some nobles developed fierce attachments to their bed servants. There are records of warmers being given special privileges, better food, warmer quarters, even small stipends. In other cases, they were dismissed abruptly over trivial things, accidentally placing the right slipper on the left foot, or sighing audibly during a boring bedtime tale about an ancestral potato. Still, you keep your composure. You say, "Yes, milady," when she mutters about the draft under the canopy. You nod sagely when she insists the lavender smells more tired than restful this evening. You fetch the good pillow, the one with the lace edging, and place it at just the right angle. By the time the candle is snuffed and your footsteps echo back down the stone hallway, you've done far more than simply warm a bed. You've curated an entire mood, tiptoed through layers of etiquette, and made your noble's descent into sleep feel like slipping into silk. And now, in the servants' quarters, you curl up on your own straw pallet, unwarmed, unscented, and blissfully free of opinions about pillow angles. You finally get to lie in the bed you've so carefully prepared, at least, in your imagination. Because tonight, we're going deep beneath those embroidered sheets to understand just what the Elizabethan nobility slept on, and in. Let's start with the basics, the mattress. It sounds simple, but even in an age before memory foam and numbered sleep systems, the Elizabethans had preferences. A proper noble's mattress was stuffed not with straw, like your average peasant's pile of itchy regret, but with a carefully curated mix of feathers and wool. Goose feathers were preferred, downy, soft, and expensive, but only the finest houses could afford full feather beds. Most noble homes settled for a sandwich, coarse wool underneath, feathers on top. Think of it as the Elizabethan version of a budget mattress topper. And the beds themselves? Massive. The kind of massive that made moving them a 2-day ordeal and required a team of servants just to rotate the mattress. Four-poster beds with thick, turned wooden legs and towering headboards were the norm. The wood was usually oak, dark, heavy, and prone to creaking loudly enough to wake the ancestors. These beds weren't just for sleeping, they were symbols of wealth, craftsmanship, and, let's be honest, overcompensation. You didn't just sleep on the bed, you nested in it. Layers were the name of the game. You started with a linen sheet, often made from locally spun flax and embroidered with personal initials or family crests. Linen was prized for its coolness in summer and warmth in winter, though your average noble cared less about breathability and more about how fine the stitching looked to the occasional bedroom guest. Next came the blankets, usually 2 or 3 thick wool covers, often dyed deep hues like burgundy, forest green, or royal blue. The dye was expensive. The blanket, doubly so. These layers were heavy, And you could easily wake up in the night feeling like you were being hugged by a well-meaning sheep. Then there were the bolster pillows, long, log-like cushions stuffed with wool, resting across the width of the bed. You were meant to prop yourself up against them, ideally while reading a book of Psalms or penning your next letter to your cousin who married into minor nobility and won't stop reminding you about it. Finally, on top of it all, came the showpiece, the coverlet or quilt. This was usually elaborately embroidered, stitched with silver or gold thread, and sometimes completely impractical for actual warmth. It was decor. A statement. And you better not drool on it. Now, while the bed itself might have been indulgent, Elizabethan nightwear was a different story, literally. You, noble sleeper, were wrapped in what could best be described as a very enthusiastic tablecloth. Nightshirts for both men and women were long, loose-fitting, and usually white or cream. Some were trimmed with lace, because nothing says ready for rest like a ruffled collar. If you were especially cold, you might add a nightcap, yes, the classic floppy one with a tassel at the end. And you thought those were just for cartoon characters. Slippers were left at the bedside. Chamber pots were tucked discreetly behind a curtain or screen. And if you were really fancy, your personal servant would lay out your morning clothes on a separate chair at the foot of the bed, because waking up and having to choose things yourself was simply not done. Still, for all this effort, sleep itself wasn't quite the 8-hour affair we think of today. Most Elizabethans, nobles included, slept in 2 segments, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by an hour or 2 of wakefulness. During this time, people might pray, read, whisper gossip to their bedmate, or, if they were bold, sneak off for a romantic rendezvous in the hall. Historians still debate whether this segmented sleep was biologically driven or simply a product of early modern life's natural rhythms. And speaking of bedmates, sleeping alone was surprisingly rare. In larger households, even nobles might share their bed with companions, siblings, trusted confidants, or visiting courtiers. Privacy was a luxury within a luxury. Curtains helped, of course, thick, velvet drapes that hung from the canopy to enclose the sleeper in a cozy, muffled cave. They trapped warmth and hushed sound, turning the bed into a private world within a very public home. One fringe curiosity? The occasional use of bedchamber charms. Amulets stitched into the mattress seams. Pouches of salt tucked into corners. These weren't just decoration, they were believed to ward off spirits, bad dreams, or, in extreme cases, bedbugs. That last one is still hotly contested by historians. Whether these charms were superstition or proto-pest control, their presence in noble bedrooms was surprisingly common. And just imagine, after all this, after the heating and fluffing and perfuming and layering, you finally slip under the covers, only to remember you left your favorite slipper by the fireplace. Tragedy. But even with a forgotten slipper or a creaky bedpost, the Elizabethan noble's sleeping setup was a marvel of layered comfort, atmospheric detail, and status-driven aesthetics. You weren't just sleeping, you were displaying your sleep. And like all displays, it had to be perfect. So tonight, as you lie in your elaborately arranged sleeping fortress, think of all the effort, human and otherwise, that went into making your descent into slumber feel effortless. Just, don't move too suddenly. That coverlet has real gold thread, and the last one cost as much as a small vineyard. Now that you're nestled among layers of wool, linen, and possibly a small embroidered angel glaring at you from the quilt, let's talk about what comes next, the ritual of retiring. Because in Elizabethan noble households, going to bed wasn't simply a matter of yawning and flopping over. Oh no, it was a ceremony. A drawn-out, delicate dance of manners, modesty, and mild pageantry, designed to end your day with the same gravitas you used to start it. You don't just go to sleep. You retire to your chambers, a phrase that immediately adds 10 pounds to your nightgown and at least 2 attendants to your general vicinity. It all begins with the candlelit procession. You've left the hall or solar where the evening's entertainment, perhaps lute music or a disturbingly long tale about a cousin's gout, has wound down. A servant carries your candle, naturally. You wouldn't dare risk dripping wax on your own sleeve. As you approach your chambers, you're greeted by at least one member of your bedchamber staff, already bustling about like a backstage crew preparing for a velvet-clad matinee. Your clothes must be removed with care. Laces loosened, stiff collars unfastened, and perhaps most crucially, your many layers of underclothes adjusted for sleep. This was no solo act, you had help, and lots of it. A personal maid or valet assisted you, offering murmured conversation and a discreet cough here and there to fill the silence. It was undignified, after all, to be quiet for too long. Someone might assume you were thinking. And this isn't just about undressing. Your hands are washed with rosewater. Your face is wiped with a cloth soaked in chamomile. In some homes, your feet are rubbed with warm oil to ease the day's walking, especially if you've spent hours pacing the estate pretending to inspect hedges you absolutely don't understand. Next comes the prayer. A short one if you're tired, a longer one if your conscience has been particularly active. Many nobles kept prayer books at their bedside, bookmarked with scraps of lace or pressed flowers, and some even wrote their own sleepy devotions in margins that are now, centuries later, preserved in museums. And then, of course, there's the matter of the dogs. The average Elizabethan noble did not sleep without their entourage of lapdogs. These weren't just pets, they were heat sources, companions, and in some cases, bark-powered burglar alarms. They had names like Buttercup, Sir Pickle, or, if someone was feeling especially clever, Lord Barkington. They had their own pillows. Their own blankets. Some even had little collars with bells, which chimed softly in the night like aristocratic wind chimes. Now, you climb into bed. Not gracefully, those beds were tall. You need a stool. Or a helpful servant's hand. The bed creaks beneath you like a galleon settling into port. The covers are drawn, your position adjusted, and finally, blissfully, the curtains are pulled closed around you. But you're not alone. Not in the haunted sense, no. But in the very real, very normal sense of sleeping with company. A spouse, a sibling, a trusted servant, or even a visiting noble of similar rank. Privacy wasn't a concept that existed the way we think of it now. Bed sharing was a matter of warmth, efficiency, and politics. Sleeping alone could seem suspicious, or worse, lonely. You're probably still clutching your night rosary or a scented cloth to keep out the night airs, believed by many to cause colds, bad humors, or, if you were unlucky, spontaneous melancholy. The Elizabethans feared the cold like a character in a Gothic novel. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it was dangerous. A chill breeze could throw your entire body out of balance. Your humors might misalign. Your spleen might, in theory, sulk. So warmth was not only about comfort, it was about health. The retiring ritual helped protect your delicate body from the world. The oils, the prayers, the dog-shaped foot warmers, they weren't just bedtime habits. They were tiny shields against the chaos of a world that still believed in ghosts, bad blood, and the healing power of goose fat. Historians still argue whether all of this ritual was widely practiced, or limited to the wealthiest households. Some suggest that even modest gentry mimicked the retiring routines of the elite in some simplified form, perhaps a single servant instead of 3, or plain wool instead of scented cloth. But in any case, retiring was more than just ending the day. It was sealing it off. Wrapping it in layers. Tucking it behind velvet. One delightful little footnote: some nobles ended the night by having a servant read aloud. Not scripture, necessarily, sometimes a romance, a classical myth, or a very dry historical account of someone's ancestor beheading someone else's ancestor over a land dispute no one remembers anymore. The servant had to read in a gentle tone, ideally without putting themselves to sleep first. And once all that was done, once the room was quiet and the fire was down to glowing orange bones, there was only the sound of your own breath, the soft sighs of dogs shifting underfoot, and perhaps, if you shared your room, a little whispered gossip before slumber pulled you both under. So, as you drift now into your own modern version of the retiring ritual, maybe just switching off a lamp and pulling the blanket a little higher, know that centuries ago, someone did much the same. Just with more lace. And possibly a bowl of warm goat's milk on the nightstand. Imagine, for a moment, that you are not a noble. You are not even a servant wielding a brass warming pan with pride. No, tonight, you are the warmth itself. A human bed warmer. Yes, in the luxurious, often eyebrow-raising world of Elizabethan England, sometimes the most effective way to warm a noble's bed was simply to put another person in it first. It sounds scandalous. It wasn't, well, not always. This practice had a surprisingly mundane purpose: body heat. In the coldest winter months, coal embers and hot stones could only do so much. Beds were large. Rooms were drafty. And if your master or mistress wanted to settle into a perfectly preheated nest of sheets, the fastest way to make that happen was to send someone in to be the oven. These warming bodies were usually low-ranking servants, young, small, unobtrusive, and preferably quiet. Their job? Climb into the bed, lie still, and warm it with their own body until the noble was ready to retire. Then, slip out quickly, quietly, and pray the linen was warm enough to avoid a complaint, or worse, a poetic critique. This practice wasn't as widespread as warming pans or hot stones, but it certainly existed. We have scattered references to it in household records and letters, often veiled in cautious phrasing. The girl was placed in the bed for the lady's comfort, one note reads, delicately sidestepping the idea that a whole human was being used as a pre-installed mattress heater. Of course, this role was delicate. It required enormous trust. You were, quite literally, in someone's most private space, before they entered it. And you had to be invisible. Leave no hair, no scent, no imprint, just warmth, like a phantom with good circulation. Historians still argue over how common this practice was. Some believe it was largely symbolic, used in only the grandest homes as a kind of status performance. Others suggest it was born of desperation, used in particularly cold regions where other warming methods were too expensive or too risky. Either way, the human bed warmer was real, and if you were assigned this duty, you likely didn't speak of it in polite company. There were variations. In some cases, the warming servant remained in the bed while the noble entered, positioned at the foot or along the edge, like a human bedstone, expected to remain still and silent until dismissed. No eye contact. No conversation. You were warmth, not a companion. In a few rare cases, usually involving children or the elderly, nobles preferred to have someone there through the night. A sleeping maid or sleeping boy would curl up at the foot of the bed to provide warmth and, if needed, alert others in case of illness or disturbance. It wasn't intimate. It was practical. And deeply awkward. Some Elizabethan physicians even recommended this practice for health. It was believed that the humors circulate more peaceably when kept in consistent warmth, and that shared body heat could ward off chill-borne illnesses. There's even a peculiar recorded prescription for a noblewoman prone to fainting spells, placed a maid with her nightly, that her vapors might not settle. So, medical. Very scientific. But the practice wasn't without risk. If something was misinterpreted, or worse, reported, reputations could suffer. Nobles had to tread carefully, and servants even more so. One case, preserved in a dusty court record, tells of a servant girl who was accused of being too familiar with the Lord's bedding. Whether or not anything happened, she was sent away to a nunnery, where presumably the only thing she warmed was her hands over a teacup. And yet, the role remained. Quietly. Discreetly. Often unacknowledged. A living comfort, a breathing shield against the night. Let's not romanticize it, though. For the servant, this job could be physically taxing and emotionally strange. You had to lie still in silence, sometimes for hours, often in stiff clothing or uncomfortable positions. And if you fell asleep, that was grounds for scolding. Or worse, demotion. Still, in some rare cases, the position came with odd perks. A higher wage. Better meals. Even, occasionally, a place of favor in the household, if you performed your job with consistent excellence and absolute discretion. One fringe anecdote tells of a nobleman who insisted on his warming boy being read to sleep by the steward before he himself entered the room. Why? No one knows. Possibly he wanted the bed to have restful energy infused in advance. Or maybe he just liked confusing the help. Whatever the reason, the practice existed in the quiet corners of noble homes, part bedtime ritual, part survival tactic, part social tightrope. It was another example of how deeply layered, and occasionally bizarre, Elizabethan domestic life could be. And tonight, as you imagine sliding quietly from the warmth of someone else's bed just as they walk in, you realize, the line between servant and setting was sometimes razor thin. You weren't just part of the household, you were part of the furniture, the insulation, the stage dressing for the noble's nightly descent into dreams. The curtain closes, the dog curls at the foot, and you, the human ember, vanish into the night. The fire has dimmed, the warming pan is back on its hook, and your noble is now gently snoring under 4 layers of wool. But as you tiptoe away from the bedchamber, you pause. Because if there's one thing that sets Elizabethan bedrooms apart from our modern sleep spaces, it's this: there is no such thing as privacy. Privacy, in the Elizabethan world, is a concept more suited to books of philosophy than actual bedrooms. In fact, you might be startled to realize that your noble's bed, ornate, curtained, and placed in the grandest room of the house, wasn't even considered a private object. It was a public statement. A throne of sleep. A stage for rest. And in some cases, a bit of light political theater. Let's take a little stroll back to court. In the royal household, it wasn't unusual for a monarch, say, Queen Elizabeth I herself, to conduct official business from her bed. Ministers and courtiers were allowed, even expected, to approach the bedchamber in the morning. Some would kneel beside the bed to deliver reports or letters while the queen reclined in a halo of ruffled pillows and perfumed sheets. Just imagine trying to explain zoning taxes to your ruler while she's still rubbing sleep out of her eyes. Your own noble household might not be quite that open, but the principle remains: beds were multifunctional spaces. You didn't just sleep there. You read. You dictated letters. You listened to music. You entertained trusted guests, who might sit on the edge of your mattress, uninvited, and talk about estate business while absent-mindedly petting your dog. This made the role of the bed-warming servant even more delicate. Because while you were responsible for preparing this sacred space, you were also entrusted with the unspoken rule: see nothing, say nothing. The curtains were your best friend. Thick and velvet, they weren't just for blocking out drafts, they were the illusion of privacy. When drawn, they separated the noble from the wider household, from the dogs, from the servants lingering just outside the door. But make no mistake, the curtains did not make the bed private. They made it feel private. This paradox extended beyond the bed, too. The room itself might be shared. Spouses often slept in the same room, but so did companions, children, even high-ranking guests. There are accounts of noblemen giving over part of their bedchamber to visiting dignitaries, not a separate guest room, but literally the same room, possibly separated by a curtain or wooden screen. So what about romantic privacy? Well, it was tricky. Let's just say that if you were hoping to sneak a kiss behind closed doors, you'd need to get creative. Privacy was a luxury not just of money, but of clever architecture, and not every manor had clever architects. Some castles were so cramped that personal space came down to how well you could whisper. Even bed curtains could betray you. While they offered warmth and a feeling of seclusion, sound traveled quickly. And servants, especially those hanging around for last-minute instructions, were excellent at hearing everything. This is partly why discretion was a prized virtue among staff. Loose lips didn't just sink ships, they could get you thrown out of a noble's service faster than you could say too many pillows. Historians still debate whether this lack of privacy was viewed as intrusive or simply normal. Some argue that the communal nature of sleep reinforced social bonds, especially among family members and close companions. Others suggest it was a subtle way of reinforcing hierarchy. Your bed, no matter how grand, was never entirely yours. Even the placement of beds tells us something. Many were situated so that they faced doors or windows, not for feng shui reasons, but to ensure the occupant could observe who entered the room. Some even had witness beds nearby, smaller beds meant for a maid or guard to sleep in, positioned within whispering distance. Just in case you needed something, or someone needed to keep an eye on you. And let's not forget the bed as a prop. During important visits, nobles sometimes displayed their finest beds in their most visible chambers. One nobleman in Warwickshire was known for leading guests past 3 entirely unused bedrooms just to show off his latest feather mattress acquisition. Whether anyone believed he actually slept in them was beside the point. One particularly legendary example is the Great Bed of Ware. This enormous, ornately carved bed could sleep at least 4 couples at once, and often did. It was placed in an inn as a novelty, and people came just to say they had slept in it. Some even carved their names into the wood. Privacy? Not so much. But as a public sleep experience? Unmatched. So tonight, as you imagine your noble slumbering behind a curtain in a room full of watching dogs, quiet servants, and perhaps the occasional cousin asleep in the chair by the fire, remember this: in the Elizabethan world, sleep was rarely solitary. It was communal. It was performative. It was a privilege monitored by others and gently managed by you, the invisible hand that warmed the sheets, lit the fire, and vanished before the snoring began. Now step back, fluff the curtain one last time, and let the illusion of solitude wrap them like a well-worn dream. You may have thought your noble's bed was large. Maybe even very large. But nothing, and we mean nothing, compares to the Great Bed of Ware. Tonight, let's indulge in a bit of legend. You're traveling with your lord through the English countryside, and you arrive at a well-known inn in the town of Ware. You're cold, of course. Your bones ache. And all you want is a place to sleep. The innkeeper leads you up a creaky staircase, past a few unimpressive chambers, and then flings open a door with great theatrical flourish. Behold! There, in the center of the room, sits a bed so massive it looks like it was built for giants. Oak-framed, carved in dizzying detail, wide enough for at least 8 people, possibly more if everyone agrees to be polite about elbows. This is the Great Bed of Ware, and if you're wondering whether it's famous, the answer is yes. Shakespeare even mentioned it in Twelfth Night, which is basically the Tudor version of going viral. Built in the 1590s, likely as a tourist attraction, or a dare, the bed measures over 10 feet wide and more than 11 feet long. It was a literal sleeping spectacle, crafted not for comfort but for bragging rights. Travelers who spent the night would carve their initials into the posts, an early version of "I was here" graffiti, which can still be seen on the bed today. It was less a bed and more a public experience. Think of it as the Elizabethan version of a theme park ride. Come, weary traveler, and cram your entire extended family into one oversized mattress. See who snores first. Try not to roll into the tanner from Ipswich. Cozy. Historians still argue whether anyone truly likes sleeping in it. Some say it was a novelty, meant to attract guests in a competitive innkeeping market. Others suggest it served a genuine purpose. Inns were often short on space, and group sleeping, especially among travelers, was normal. If you and your companions were relatively clean and not prone to sleep kicking, why not share? But the Great Bed of Ware wasn't the only legendary sleep structure. Across England and beyond, beds were growing in size, grandeur, and ambition. Some noble households commissioned beds so wide they required custom-woven sheets, and servants to wrestle them into place like ship sails in a storm. Others created towering bedposts with carved griffins, angels, or entire hunting scenes etched into the headboards. You didn't just lie down, you entered a kind of carved, padded theater. One fringe tale tells of a bed designed for a noble couple and their 6 favorite dogs. The dogs were reportedly given their own miniature pillows and a snack rail at the foot. Sadly, the rail's design failed when one of the dogs attempted to jump it and took a bowl of stewed eel with him. The pillows were never the same. And beds weren't just for sleeping, they were backdrops for life events. Births, deaths, strategic conversations, even royal audiences. Monarchs routinely held levees and couches, morning and evening rituals where courtiers were admitted to watch or assist with the king or queen rising from or retiring to bed. That's right, if you were lucky, you got to watch your sovereign brush their teeth. Kind of. These moments weren't private, they were performative, symbolic of access and power. And the more elaborate the bed, the more impressive the setting. Tapestries hung behind the headboard. Canopies embroidered with celestial scenes or family mottos soared overhead. In one known case, a duke had his family tree stitched into the bed curtains, in case anyone forgot just how important he was. Even the accessories became larger than life. Pillows the size of ottomans. Quilts so thick they needed 2 servants to fold them back. Bed steps carved from marble. One noblewoman in Kent insisted her bed have tiny gold bells sewn along the canopy's fringe, not to ring, but simply to catch candlelight in a way that made her hair seem glorious and saint-like at dusk. Naturally. Still, beneath the excess, these beds shared a common goal: warmth, comfort, and a good night's sleep in an era where comfort was rare and warmth hard-won. No matter how grand the bed frame, someone still had to heat the sheets, fluff the bolsters, and ensure there were no crumbs from last night's marzipan binge. Tonight, you glance around the bedchamber and feel its grandeur pressing in. The tapestries ripple gently in the cold air. The fire is a red eye in the hearth. The bed, your noble's pride and joy, rises like a stage, waiting for the curtain to fall. And somewhere far away, the great bed of Ware creaks in its museum home, no longer stuffed with squirming guests or marked by soot-smudged initials, but still standing. Still waiting. A monument to Elizabethan sleep and the slightly chaotic way people tried to make it warmer, softer, and a little more theatrical. So next time you toss and turn in your modest modern bed, remember, there was once a time when sleeping was a group activity, and a bed wasn't just a bed, it was an adventure. You wake up, still groggy, and notice the faintest chill clinging to the air. You burrow deeper under the blankets, grateful for the lingering warmth, and for your servant who battled the night's frost before you even yawned. But in the Elizabethan world, warmth was more than comfort. It was healthcare. Or at least, what passed for it. Let's be honest, Elizabethan medicine was a strange and speculative affair. Illness wasn't just caused by germs, which no one had really heard of yet, but by bad air, upset humors, celestial misalignment, and, occasionally, your neighbor's suspicious cabbage crop. So naturally, the cold was seen as a prime suspect in just about every diagnosis. If you sneezed, it was the chill. If you felt melancholy, it was cold creeping into your liver. If your joints ached, well, clearly you'd left your foot out from under the covers for too long. And so, warmed beds were more than a luxury, they were a line of defense. A nightly ritual to keep your body in balance and your insides from sulking. Physicians of the time wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of sleeping in an unheated bed. A man must be wrapped in temperance, one wrote, lest the vapors of coldness stir his humors to madness. Translation: wear a nightcap, avoid night breezes, and definitely keep that brass warming pan in steady rotation. For the upper class, it became a point of pride to have a health-conscious sleeping routine. Rich households kept firewood stockpiled for winter nights. Herbal sachets were placed near the pillows, lavender to calm the mind, rosemary to ward off infection, and camphor to encourage the dispersing of phlegmatic vapors. Which is the fanciest way of saying stops your nose from being stuffy. Some even believe that a hot bed could prevent more serious conditions. Gout, for instance, was thought to arise from moist vapors trapped in the feet. So naturally, you needed to warm your legs thoroughly each night to avoid waking up with a toe that felt like it had been pinched by God's crab claw. For women, the beliefs around cold were even more layered. A cold womb, they said, could cause infertility, hysteria, or bouts of the vapors, a wonderfully vague term for everything from anxiety to boredom. Doctors encouraged young noblewomen to sleep with extra layers, herbal warming pads, and even small live animals, lapdogs, ideally, tucked beneath the covers to maintain the appropriate temperature of their feminine constitution. There are actual accounts of noble women refusing to get out of bed for entire mornings simply because the air was not fit for breathing. This wasn't laziness, it was caution. They weren't avoiding chores, they were dodging hypothetical lung dampness. One particularly popular medical manual advised that all beds in winter should be warmed not once, but twice, once before the noble retired, and once again just after they fell asleep, to renew the curative heat. That second warming? Often done by sneaking in with a fresh pan while the sleeper dozed, praying they didn't roll over into the embers. And yet, despite all this care, people still got sick. Winter brought waves of colds, fevers, and something called ague, which may have been malaria, a bad flu, or just a very dramatic chill. But in the eyes of the Elizabethan physician, many of these ailments were caused not by other people, but by air. Cold air, specifically. This led to some bizarre sleep practices. Windows were kept sealed tight with waxed linen, even when fires were burning. Doors were draped with heavy wool. One lord had his bed placed directly beside the hearth, and insisted on keeping the fire lit all night. He claimed it chased the death wind from the room, though his servants mostly just complained about the ash. Fringe records even describe a short-lived trend among hypochondriac nobles who slept inside boxes. That's right, wooden boxes, lined with fur and heated stones, like a cozy tomb designed to block out all drafts and questionable vapors. One pamphlet mocked this as sleeping in one's own coffin to avoid dying outside it, but the practice persisted for at least a few seasons. Of course, not all warming strategies worked as intended. Bedstones occasionally cracked from being overheated, sending sharp slivers into the mattress. A cracked pot of boiling water once leaked into a featherbed, resulting in a soggy mess so legendary it earned a mention in a local ballad. The rhyme didn't survive, but the indignity certainly did. Historians still puzzle over how much of these practices were based on true experience versus folklore, but one thing is clear: warmth was taken very seriously. And the bed, whether laced with herbs or smothered in quilts, was seen as the battlefield upon which wellness was defended. So tonight, as your noble snores softly, blissfully unaware of the scented pouch tucked beneath their bolster or the still warm stone at their feet, you, dutiful bed warmer, have played a part in their survival. You've fended off bad humors, lingering chills, and the imagined specter of death wind. Not bad for someone wielding a metal pan and a good sense of timing. Now we slip into a quieter corner of the household, the one just outside the curtain, just beyond the bedpost. Because while your noble sleeps snugly, you, the humble bed-warming servant, are wide awake. And from this peculiar vantage point, you see everything. Your role might be soft-footed and silent, but don't let anyone fool you, it's also the best seat in the house for witnessing the hidden dramas of noble life. From fumbled nightcaps to whispered secrets, from midnight ailments to the rhythmic growl of snoring mastiffs, your life is lived in the shadows of someone else's bedtime. Tonight, for instance, the Countess asked you to warm her sheets thrice. A bit excessive, perhaps, but she's convinced the damp in the north wing is conspiring against her sinuses. So you go. Once before supper. Once at the bell. And once again, tiptoeing in after she's fallen asleep, to replace the stone at her feet with a freshly heated one. You are quiet. Ghost-like. A phantom with coal dust on your apron. And in this silence, you observe the noble's face twitching during a dream. The slow, deliberate way he rearranges the pillows himself when he thinks no one's looking. The half-spoken words murmured just before sleep takes hold. These are the human things, raw, unguarded, and never intended for the court or the parlor. It's not just sights, either. Smells tell stories, too. You can guess the evening's dinner by the faint aroma lingering in the blankets, pigeon pie, perhaps. Or almond custard. You smell lavender tucked into a sleeve, clove oil rubbed on sore joints, the acrid whisper of ink from a journal stashed under the pillow. You also hear things. Tiny sounds with enormous implications. A sigh from the wrong bed. A slippered step in the hallway after midnight. A softly closed door when all should be still. You say nothing, of course. Not because you aren't curious, but because your job depends on silence. Servants who listen too closely don't last long. Historians still debate how much of noble intrigue passed through the ears of staff like you, bedchamber servants, warming maids, night grooms. Some believe you were the true chroniclers of the age, privy to confessions and quarrels no scribe could ever record. Others argue you were simply invisible, trained to tune out the world and focus only on the sheets, the stones, the subtle choreography of the nighttime routine. But you know the truth lies somewhere in between. You are invisible when needed. Present when required. The listener who hears without judgment. The hands that serve without witness. And in some rare cases, if you're especially trusted, the one asked to stay. Take Lady Arlingford, for instance. She couldn't sleep without someone nearby. Not beside her in the bed, mind you, but within reach. Just beyond the curtain. You sat in the corner with a warmed pot at your feet, half dozing, your job done, except for being there. Her father had died suddenly when she was a girl, and ever since, the silence of night unnerved her. Your presence was a kind of medicine. She never spoke to you directly. Just the occasional nod. But once, as dawn's light slipped through the shutters, she murmured, "Thank you," into the linen. You never mentioned it. And she never said it again. Other nights aren't so gentle. You've seen noblemen wake gasping from dreams, grabbing for invisible swords or calling names you're not meant to recognize. One Viscount once leapt from bed convinced he was under attack by French ghosts. You helped him back under the covers and lit a candle. He didn't remember it in the morning. Or chose not to. Sometimes you find yourself in the aftermath of arguments. Tears hastily wiped away. Beds where one pillow lies untouched. You fluff it anyway. The ritual continues, no matter what. There's a strange comfort in the predictability of it all. The bed must be warmed. The fire must be fed. The curtains drawn, the slippers placed, the pot emptied. It doesn't matter if the world is crumbling outside, or if a duke has just been exposed in a scandal involving powdered wigs and a missing turkey. Sleep must go on. And through it all, you remain. You, the quiet witness to the private life of people whose public lives are carved into stone and stitched into banners. Your name won't be remembered. Your stories won't be told. But for a brief moment, you are the keeper of their dreams. The guardian of warmth. There's an old superstition passed among the servants, a warm bed tells no tales. And yet, you know better. It whispers. In linen creases and ash stains, in the placement of a pillow or the weight of a sigh. You've learned to read it like a book, one never meant to be opened. So tonight, you finish your rounds. You check the fire one last time. You straighten the drape that fluttered open. You extinguish the candle, carefully, so no wax spills. And you step back, out of the light, back into the hallway with its cold flagstones and distant echoes. Behind you, the noble sleeps. And everything is exactly as it should be. You've nearly made it through the night, but not before things take a turn, as they often do in noble households where sleep is supposed to be sacred, but never quite stays peaceful. Because sometimes, the bed becomes a battlefield. Tonight, it starts with a cough. A dry, persistent one echoing from behind the bed curtains. Your master has woken up, grumbling, and now calls out groggily for that syrup the apothecary left. You, naturally, are already halfway across the chamber in the dark, retrieving a pewter spoon and a glass vial of something that smells suspiciously like overcooked prunes. You administer it gently, carefully avoiding eye contact, because nobles never want to be seen sick. Illness, to them, is weakness, unless, of course, they're milking it for sympathy from a visiting duchess. You hand over the posset cup, warm milk, nutmeg, and a splash of sack, and tuck the blankets back in, as though you can soothe the fever by sheer force of neatness. But the bed has turned against him. The sheets are too hot. The pillow too low. There's a draft, though you've sealed every shutter. And now the Countess, his wife, is stirring as well, because, naturally, she takes offense at how much he's thrashing. Within moments, you're witnessing what modern couples might call a disagreement. In Elizabethan terms, it's more of a gentle duel with words sharpened by years of carefully repressed frustration. She says I snore, the noble complains loudly into the darkness, yet she breathes like a dying horse when she sleeps. That's rich, coming from a man who farts every time he rolls over, comes the drowsy reply. You, the bed-warming servant, are very busy with the fire and cannot hear anything, obviously. What follows is a classic Elizabethan bedtime spat. These were more common than you'd think. Marriages, particularly among the nobility, were often political arrangements first and personal ones second. Beds, unfortunately, had to serve both roles, diplomatic forum and battleground for sore knees, bruised egos, and snatched covers. Some couples, knowing this, developed sleep arrangements that minimized contact. Separate bolsters. Designated halves of the bed. One notable pair kept a decorative ribbon pinned to the center sheet, just to remind each other where the invisible barrier lay. It was adorable, if slightly passive-aggressive. Still, the drama wasn't always verbal. Beds could become staging grounds for other conflicts, servants falling out of favor, poisoned inheritances, or poorly timed romantic affairs. One earl's diary described his bed as a place of rest, and occasionally, battlefield and barricade. He didn't elaborate, but the imagination happily fills in the blanks. And then there were the medical emergencies. Stomachaches from questionable game pies. Toothaches that sent nobles scrambling for hot cloths and vinegar-soaked rags. Mysterious night fevers that left the sheets drenched and the staff whispering in the hallway. As the warming servant, you were the first summoned, expected to fix what no one quite understood. Fetch the mustard poultice, they'd say. Bring the peppermint tincture. Or, just bring something warm. Warmth, after all, was the eternal remedy. For aches, for chills, for the soul. And so, even when you had no clue what was wrong, you'd quietly reheat the stones. Slip them into the bed's foot. Adjust the pillows, one more time. Offer comfort not with words, but with heat and steadiness. Historians still argue whether these bed-bound incidents shaped the politics of noble households. Some suggest that the most trusted servants, the ones allowed to stay near the chamber at night, held significant informal power. After all, in a world where privacy was rare, whoever held the ear of a drowsy noble in his nightshirt might just influence the outcome of tomorrow's estate business. And sometimes, in those long nights filled with murmurs and discomfort, something else surfaced: vulnerability. Nobles, stripped of their daytime grandeur, became real. Fearful. Fragile. They confessed regrets. Asked strange questions. Wondered aloud about mortality. "Do you think I shall go to heaven?" one knight once asked his servant while staring at the ceiling, eyes glassy with fever. "Only if you stop stealing the kitchen wine, my lord," the servant allegedly replied. Of course, there were also lighter incidents. One baron's bed collapsed during a thunderstorm, too many dogs, too much pudding, and an unfortunately aged bed frame. He reportedly yelled, "The floor's cursed," and refused to sleep in that room again. Another noblewoman developed a habit of rearranging all the pillows every hour. She claimed the spirits got them twisted if left too long. You, the ever-dutiful bed warmer, saw it all. Fought minor fires. Mediated soft arguments. Pretended not to notice when a weeping heir tiptoed back from his mother's chamber. You warmed more than just beds, you warmed relationships, frayed nerves, and occasionally bruised pride. And when the dawn finally comes, seeping in through the gaps in the tapestry-covered windows, you'll tidy the battlefield. Smooth the rumpled sheets. Replace the scorched stone that cracked during the night. Brush away the crumbs from that forbidden midnight marchpane. By morning, the room will look serene again. As though the bed never once groaned beneath the weight of stress, secrets, or stomach pain. Only you know otherwise. Because while the bed may be the warmest place in the house, it's also the one where everything eventually comes to the surface. The fire is a soft orange glow now. It no longer warms the room, it only reminds it that warmth once existed. You stand in the hallway, watching a thin trail of smoke drift lazily from the hearth, and you realize something: the profession you serve, the quiet, coal-dusted art of bed warming, is vanishing. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, it's subtle. A nobleman who decides he'd rather use heated bricks than rely on a servant. A noblewoman who imports a new contraption from the Low Countries, something made of tin and lined with porcelain. A house guest who marvels at the German iron flask that stays warm till morning. Technology has arrived. Enter the warming bottle, the ancestor of the hot water bottle. Made of copper or pewter, these vessels are filled with hot water and slipped under the sheets without so much as a puff of ash. No soot. No fire risk. No servants with red faces and blistered knuckles. Just convenient, self-contained heat. You watch one being delivered for the first time. The lady of the house claps her hands with delight. The chambermaid, looking slightly relieved, passes you a glance. There's no panic. No bitterness. Just the quiet knowledge that something has shifted. Then come the stoves. By the early 1600s, portable braziers, small containers for hot coals, become increasingly common, especially in wealthier homes. Safer. Smaller. Easier to manage. Soon, bed warming becomes a task that doesn't require a person at all, just a tool. And if the tool works, why keep the person? Historians still debate whether this transition was welcomed or mourned. On the one hand, households became safer. Fires caused by careless embers decreased. Sheets lasted longer without burn holes. On the other hand, a tradition, one built on trust, silence, and intimacy, was disappearing. Some nobles resisted. No bottle warms like Mary's hand, one elderly knight is said to have declared, waving off a servant offering a tin flask. But Mary, his warming maid of 20 years, had already been reassigned to the scullery. He still called her name at night, sometimes, but no one corrected him. You notice that your own duties are changing. You're sent to polish brass fittings. To check the linen store. You still warm the beds, but only when the bottles go missing, or the stoves aren't quite hot enough. You're now a backup plan. And then, you're not. One spring morning, the steward tells you there's no need to prep the pan anymore. The master has taken to using the new warming drawers, small compartments built into the bed frame, warmed with coal before sleep and cooled by morning. They're a marvel of craftsmanship. And they make you unnecessary. You still work in the house, of course. There's always more to be done, scrubbing, folding, fetching. But the ritual you once performed with care and precision is now gone. No more warming stones. No more softly brushing ash from the covers. No more slipping into the bedchamber like a shadow and slipping out before the first snore. One by one, households across England follow suit. The warming pan is hung above the hearth like a relic. Children ask what it's for. Some are used as decorations. Others are buried in old trunks or repurposed as fireplace scoops. In time, even the beds themselves begin to change. Canopies grow smaller. Curtains fall out of fashion. The towering four-posters are replaced by simpler frames. Bed sharing becomes less common. People demand privacy. Personal space. The age of communal warmth gives way to solitude. And the servant who once held the ember becomes a footnote. There's a peculiar melancholy in watching your own role vanish. You were never famous. You didn't wear livery or hold a title. But you mattered. You were the last person in the room before dreams arrived. The keeper of the night's quiet comfort. The guardian of warmth. One fringe record, written in a servant's diary, tells of a retired bed-warming maid who still carried a pouch of lavender with her everywhere, even long after she'd stopped working in the chambers. She said it helped her sleep. She missed the ritual. The routine. The satisfaction of hearing someone sigh as they slipped into warmth and never knew how it got there. Historians still argue whether this change was inevitable, part of the march of progress, or a quiet loss, barely noticed. But tonight, you feel it deeply. As you stand in the dim corridor, your fingers brush the handle of your now retired pan. Cold. Smooth. Forgotten. You hang it back on the wall. Gently. Reverently. And for the first time in years, you walk away from a bed without checking its corners, without whispering good night to no one. You don't need to anymore. The hallways are quieter now. Fewer footsteps at night. Fewer candles flickering behind heavy doors. Somewhere behind you, a new servant tends the fire with a stovepipe and a flint spark, not a bundle of coal and a long-handled pan. And you, once the silent guardian of warmth, have become something else, an observer, perhaps, of a world that no longer knows it needed you. But even as the brass pan gathers dust and modern conveniences nudge the old ways aside, you can't help but remember. Not just the work. The feeling. Because once upon a time, warming a bed was not just about heat. It was about care. You knew every thread in those sheets. Every creak of that bed frame. Every tiny ritual that made the bed feel more than a pile of fabric. It became a haven. A place where power gave way to dreams. Where a noble shed their crown, metaphorical or not, and curled into something human. You still remember the little things. How Lady Cecily liked 2 bolsters, but only one warmed. How Sir Allard's gout meant his feet needed 3 stones, not 2. How the Viscount's terrier would refuse to sleep unless you folded the corner of the blanket into a tiny nest. No one taught you this, it was learned over time, through hundreds of quiet nights and the soft rustle of linen. Sometimes, nobles whispered to you. Nothing important, maybe. But it meant something. Thank you, they'd murmur. Or, don't forget the rosewater tonight, will you? And once, just once, if I don't wake up, make sure the shutters are left open in the morning. Not all of it was kind. Some scowled if the bed wasn't warm enough. Others scolded for imagined mistakes. But that never dulled your dedication. You warmed the beds of saints and scoundrels alike. You stood beside candles guttering in the wind. You listened to rain hammer against the shutters, and made sure the sheets were dry before anyone ever knew they might have been damp. Historians rarely write about servants like you. You don't appear in the margins of illuminated manuscripts or the footnotes of royal correspondence. But for the people you served, you were indispensable. A background presence who made the hard stone world a little softer, a little more bearable. And now? Now the world has moved on. Iron flasks and coiled pipes hum quietly in the walls of manor houses. Sleep is managed by machinery, not men. And the bed warming pan has become an heirloom. Decorative. Antique. It hangs above the hearth like a trophy from a forgotten sport. You pass by it one evening and find a younger servant polishing the handle. He asks what it was for. You smile. And you tell him, softly, slowly, about the nights you warmed the great bed of Ware, or how Lady Arlingford once claimed the bed hadn't truly been warmed unless you had done it. You explain the slow circle of embers. The careful timing. The weight of responsibility behind every gentle gesture. The young servant nods politely. But you know he doesn't quite understand. Not yet. That's all right. Because the bed remembers. The warmth you left behind isn't just in the wool. It lingers in memory, like the scent of lavender long after the sachet has crumbled to dust. You were part of something strange and beautiful, a quiet ritual in a loud world. The unsung magic that turned cold sheets into sanctuary. So tonight, as the house rests and sleep wraps its arms around every bedchamber, you rest too. Not in sorrow. Not in bitterness. But with a quiet kind of pride. You warmed the world once. And for those who remember, whether they say so or not, that warmth never truly faded. And now, as the last embers glow low on the hearth, you can feel the weight of the blankets settle gently over you. The kind of weight that doesn't press, but reassures. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of quiet memory. The room softens. Shadows stretch longer. The air is still, but not cold, never cold, not when the warmth of all those nights lingers quietly in the corners. Outside, the wind continues its slow, patient journey across the trees. But inside, nothing stirs. The candle is low. The dogs are asleep. And your work is done. Your hands, once red with ash, now rest calmly in your lap. The scent of rosemary and wool still clings faintly in the air, like a lullaby too old to be sung aloud, yet too familiar to ever forget. You are part of something larger now. A tradition faded, yes, but not forgotten. Somewhere, in a quiet museum or an old manor on the edge of memory, a brass warming pan gleams in the dim light. No longer used. But never truly lost. And as your eyes grow heavy, and your breath slows to the rhythm of a house asleep, you know what comes next. Not work. Not worry. Just rest. Just warmth. Just the gentle hush of a night that remembers. Good night.